Did Jesus rise from the dead? This is the question that is at the heart of Christianity. As Paul said, if Christ has not risen, then our faith is in vain. It really is the central argument for the faith of Christianity. So I'm excited to introduce my guest to you today. His name is Dr. Michael Licona. He has a PhD in New Testament from the University of Pretoria. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. He is an associate professor in theology at Houston Baptist University, and he's the president of Risen Jesus Ministries. It's a ministry that he runs, and he travels and debates skeptics like the well-known skeptic Bart Ehrman on whether or not Jesus rose from the dead, the historicity of the resurrection and the New Testament. And so we had a great discussion about the resurrection. He's written a great book called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus with his co-author, Gary Habermas. If you haven't got that, follow the link in the description and get a copy of that. It's, as far as I can tell, one of the best books on the resurrection for sure. I really enjoy it. And again, it's such a vital book and such a vital question and debate topic, because if Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is true, period. It follows that God exists, that the Bible is God's word, etc. It really is at the heart of the matter. Of course, thanks for listening. If you enjoy the episode, if you enjoy this podcast, be sure to like it and subscribe to the podcast. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Leave a review, all that good stuff. If you want to listen to the bonus segment, as well as all of our bonus segments, be sure to follow the Patreon link in the description below and become a supporter of our ministry. Thanks so much for joining us, guys, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, hello and welcome to Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. My name is Haden Clark, your host, and today I am excited to introduce my special guest to you. His name is Dr. Michael Licona, and he helped co-author the book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, with Gary Habermas. So, Dr. Licona, how are you doing today, sir?
Oh, good, Hayden. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming on. I'm sure you got a busy schedule, and I'm very happy to have you on. I know we've been trying to schedule this and have you on for a while, and I'm really excited. The book you authored with Dr. Gary Habermas that I mentioned, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, is one of my more favorite books, and especially in apologetics. I think the resurrection is really central to apologetics. If we can get this one, it seems to me that everything else follows upon that. You know what? I think Paul actually said something about that, something similar to that as well. But yeah, so thanks so much for agreeing to do this. Before we get into the resurrection and all that, if you don't mind introducing yourself to the audience for those who may or may not be familiar with who you are.
Yeah, well, I'll be 58 in a couple of months here, and I grew up in Baltimore in a Christian family. I became a Christian at the age of 10. There was a Christian magician that came by at our church one Sunday, and they pulled all the Sunday school classes together, and they related the tricks, the illusions with the gospel. And for the first time, I understood the message that it wasn't what I did that earned me salvation. It's what Christ did for me. And he gave an invitation, which was weird. It was a Presbyterian church, but he gave an invitation. I remember 3 of us went forward, and so he tricked me into the kingdom,
There you go. I was going to say, I don't know if I would have shared that now. I'm just kidding, on an apologetics podcast, but.
So, yeah, I didn't grow too much spiritually during my teens. I went to a Christian university. I was planning on going to just a state university and, being a music major, specializing in jazz. I played saxophone. My objective was to be a professional musician, but my parents asked me if I wanted to go to Liberty University or check it out for college for a weekend. And I thought, well, I don't want to go there, but yeah, I'll check it out. And I went down, and wow, the warm environment. I mean, I'd been in public schools my whole life, and the warm Christian environment there was just, it's like, wow, I have to go here. So, so that's where I went. Finished up my bachelor's in applied music, but I was just growing so close to the Lord during that time, and I wanted to get deeper and deeper in the Word. So I decided I wanted to learn Greek, and so I went for a master's degree in New Testament studies, just specialized in Greek was my main thing. But toward the end of my degree, I just started questioning whether Christianity was true. wasn't anything I was really learning. It was just a matter of, well, I was brought up in a Christian family. Maybe that's why I'm a Christian. I think I've got this relationship with God, but maybe people of other religions think the same thing. How do I know what I believe is true? And apologetics, I had no use for it until I needed it.
Yeah.
And then someone introduced me to Gary Habermas, and he turned me on to a lot of different resources, and so that just became a passion of
Hmm.
mine and got me involved in it. Never thought I'd go for a doctorate, um, but I ended up doing that just because I wanted to get deeper and learn more and more, and went through a period of serious questioning of my faith when I was in my doctoral program. Worked through it, and so yeah, so this has just
Yeah.
become a passion in my life, and I agree with you. If Jesus rose from the dead, we can know Christianity is true, period, and there's nothing that changes that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you mentioned something that I say kind of often on here is that most of the apologists I know, and I'm not going to throw myself in that camp, but this is how I became familiar with apologetics as well, was through what I call apologetics by necessity. I didn't have any other choice. It was either I could no longer muster up blind faith or something like that. There's either answers or I'm out, is what
Yeah.
it really came down to. And well, I mean, obviously I feel like I found some answers. But take us through kind of that period of doubt. I think this is important for Christians, dealing with doubt or just admitting that you even have doubts. But what specific doubts were you having at the time whenever you, as you said, you had a period of questioning?
Yeah. Well, I've had several periods of doubt, to be honest with you.
Yes.
The first period of doubt toward the end of my graduate studies, it was the first time I'd ever really doubted the Christian faith. And well, I can remember walking into Gary Habermas's office and talking to him, and he says, well, what are you thinking? And I said, well, how do we know Jesus really rose from the dead rather than he was just an alien playing a joke on us? And he said, all right. He said, well, we'll call this the cosmic joke hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
And so we discussed that for a little, and I felt pretty good, walking out of his office. But then later on, I just started to doubt some things. I had this view of a very, a high view of Scripture. I believe that it's God's word, His inerrant word, divinely inspired. Everything's true in it. And when I'm out in the real world and I'm hearing objections, well, Matthew, Mark, and John didn't write the Gospels, and what about all these contradictions in them and all this kind of stuff? And it really rocked my world, and that started, that really drove me deeper into apologetics and some things like that. So. And then later on, as I'm doing my doctoral studies, it wasn't a matter of any naturalistic or alternative hypothesis to the resurrection. It was a matter of, well, there are smarter people than me that disagree. A lot of other people disagree. They look at the same data, they just don't agree. Am I missing something here? And then it's, when occasionally now when I experience doubts, they're emotional doubts. They're not intellectual doubts. It's kind of like, well, what if?
Mm-hmm.
And the way I describe it when I lecture now is I'll be up on a stage and I'll say, a lot of times when you get on a stage of a big church, they've got their lighting all set up. And so they have these little markers on the stage that people in the audience don't see. They're just little pieces of masking tape or something. And they'll tell the speaker, well, stay, on this side of this little piece of tape, because this is where the lighting is. If you go outside, the lighting's not going to hit you. It's not going to look good. So, so I'll just say, well, okay, I can stay within this space. It's pretty easy. I mean, let's say it's just 6 feet, one way, front to back. And let's say that lane extends from one side of the stage to the other. Well, I could stay on that really easy. I could walk backwards. I could run backwards. I could do cartwheels on the stage. Well, at least I used to be able to. I may not want to try it now,
No.
but I could do it. I could do it blindfolded. I could walk backward and stay in that. But you take that same kind of spacing, 6 feet wide, make a plank 6 feet wide and extend it 1,000 feet above the ground between two skyscrapers and say, okay, now I want you to walk from one end to the other. Well, technically, I know I can do it. It shouldn't be a problem at all. But you're going to have a hard time getting me out on that thing.
Right.
Because what if? And it's like the consequences of not being able to do it are so scary that, it really makes you doubt. It makes you worry. So, I look at the evidence and I say, well, the evidence certainly points to the resurrection of Jesus. No question about that. But what if I'm wrong? What if another religion is correct? Or what if Christianity is false and there's a different way to get to heaven and I missed out?
Mm-hmm.
What if my biases prevent me from discovering truth and it costs me eternity? That's the kind of stuff that haunts me sometimes and causes doubt. But it's emotional doubt. It's not intellectual doubt.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for being honest about it. And I guess I completely agree. But okay, let's get into the resurrection and the evidence for it. So let's just say we're in everyday conversation here, and I'm somebody that does not believe that Jesus rose from the dead. How would you go about trying to convince me?
Well, I'm going to realize I have limited time, right? So try to make it as simple and just say I'll give you some things, and then we can unpack them as you like.
Sure.
So say, okay, well, here's something that virtually every scholar who studies the subject agrees upon, even skeptics, and that is that shortly after Jesus' death, his disciples were claiming that Jesus had been raised from the dead and had appeared to them. Virtually everyone agrees on it. In fact, virtually everyone agrees that they had experiences that led them to that conclusion. Mm-hmm. But I don't even have to go that far. I can just say, look, everybody seems to agree that they were at least claiming. Mm-hmm. You can say they were lying, hallucinating, whatever, but they're at least claiming that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. Are you fine with that? You want me to give evidence for it, or can we move on from there?
So whenever you say everyone, virtually everyone agrees with this, are you talking about historians in general, or are you talking about New Testament scholars, or
both? Yeah,
both.
If you're talking about professional historians who have actually looked into this issue, mm-hmm. New Testament scholars who have actually looked into the issue, written on the issue, because it's something that it's kind of like this. Scholars have opinions on a lot of things, okay? But if it's nothing that they've studied, really given enough study to, their views aren't really valuable. They're not significant unless they have, either specialized in it or spent enough time to get a really good grasp on it.
Right.
So, I mean, if you asked me to comment on archaeological stuff, I can't. It's just not lane. Mm-hmm. It's not something I've really given myself to. I might be able to comment on a number of theological issues related to the New Testament, but I'm not an expert in a lot of the theological issues. I focus on the historical stuff. So I'm referring to historian minded.
Cool. Okay, so first point is the majority agree that
almost everyone. You're
not just
going to find a few flakes, right?
Yeah.
But almost everyone does.
Agrees that the
disciples were claiming Jesus rose and appeared to them. I mean, first of all, you got Paul, and there's 13 letters in the New Testament attributed to him, of which almost all scholars acknowledge that they're in agreement on at least 7 of them. That he wrote those 7. There's disputes about the other 6, but virtually everyone agrees on those 7. So you can just take those 7, like 1 Corinthians, where Paul is claiming that Jesus appeared to him. Mm-hmm. All right. And he's saying that the disciples were saying the same thing. Yeah. In Galatians, he says he goes back to Jerusalem and meets with Peter, James, and John, the lead apostles. And they've certified he's proclaiming what they're preaching. Mm-hmm. Death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus. So you've got Paul. You've got oral tradition that's peppered throughout Paul's undisputed letters, like in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, where, Paul's getting this from the Jerusalem apostles and things. So you got this oral tradition. You got the Acts sermon summaries that contains the kerygma, the proclamation of the apostles. You can go to Clement of Rome and Polycarp, and they're basically saying that Paul's preaching what they're preaching and things like this. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And, John, most scholars do believe that if John's not one of Jesus' disciples, John's primary witness was one of Jesus' disciples. Right. And most scholars do think that Mark's primary witness was the Apostle Peter. So you got claims of resurrection there. So, I mean, it's almost beyond doubt, beyond dispute, that Jesus' disciples were making such a claim.
For sure. Okay, so
It's like, what do you do with that?
Right. So point number one, and then obviously it seems like you're going to build a cumulative case here. So what would point number two be?
Well, you got to say, well, did he appear to them or not?
Right.
There's no other option.
Yeah.
They're making a claim he appeared to them. He either did or he didn't. Well, if he didn't appear to them, what's the deal here?
Mm-hmm.
Well, did they think he did, or did they really not think he did?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if they didn't think he did, that means they were lying, right?
Right.
Or they were using it in some other sense, like a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
So for that, I would say, virtually everyone today agrees that they weren't lying about it, because we've got enough records to show, ancient records, at least 11 ancient sources that tell us that the disciples were willing to suffer. They were willing to die, and at least some of them did die as Christian martyrs for their gospel proclamation. And so the chances that all of them were dying for a known lie, or were willing to die and suffered for a known lie, that's extremely unlikely.
Right.
So hardly anyone today thinks that they were lying. I don't know of anyone today that thinks they were lying, scholars. Right. So the other thing would be well, if they really didn't think that he rose, but they were claiming he did, well, they were using it as a metaphor. So, Jesus' teachings still live on today.
Right.
But, that's not what Paul was teaching. Paul says basically, if Christ has not been raised, we're not going to be raised, and the Christian life is not worth living. That makes absolutely no sense if they're meaning in a metaphorical sense. And then you look at how the skeptics interpreted the Christians. They said the disciples stole the body. They said the gardener reburied the body. They said Jesus faked his death. Well, that's all to account for an empty tomb and things like this. Mm-hmm. So if the Christians meant it as metaphor, they were communicating it in the worst possible way, because all the skeptics of which we're aware interpreted them as making a claim that it was a historical event. And then when the Christians responded, they defended that it was a historical event. Mm-hmm. So there's really nothing here that would lead us to believe that the disciples claimed it, he didn't rise from the dead, and they claimed he appeared to them, and they really didn't think that he appeared to them.
Right. Yeah.
It has to be that they really believed he appeared to them.
Okay. So we've gotten that he really did, or that they really did believe it, which isn't exactly the same thing as saying it actually happened. That's a fair distinction?
Yeah, it's not the same thing to say it happened. It's just saying they actually believed he rose from the dead.
Yeah, okay. So then how do we move in this conversation with a skeptic or with someone that's not a Christian from making that claim that, well, the earliest disciples really did believe? How do we move from that to it did actually happen?
Well, you got to look at some things here, and you say, well, what's the best explanation? All right, so if he didn't appear to them, but he really believed it, what are you looking at? Well, the most common objection or answer to that would be hallucinations.
That's the most common?
Yeah, that's the most common.
Well, I always find that the easiest one to write off.
Oh, I agree.
But it really is the most common, like...
Even by scholars. A lot of them will call it visions, okay? And what they mean by that is subjective visions, because it's almost like an elusive term. They're not saying hallucinations because that's too easy to be caught on. But when you actually get down to it and you say, okay, well, there are really only kind of two kinds of visions here. You've got subjective visions, which would be like a hallucination. Nothing objective is happening here. It's something that's just going on in their head. And the other is it's an objective vision, which means it is an actual event, even if it's not occurring in space-time. So if you're claiming it's a vision. So that'd be like an out-of-body experience, or maybe something like Paul experienced. According to Acts, it would be an objective vision, because not only did Paul see it, but so did some of the others. Mm-hmm. Okay. Of course, it could have been an event in space-time, but Jesus is this bright light comes out of heaven, and it would appear, since the others, according to Acts, saw the light and they actually heard the voice, then that would be an objective experience. An objective vision, though, would be something like Peter in, Acts chapter 10, when he has this vision from heaven. It's a real vision revealing to him actual things that are happening. It's not a hallucination. It's an objective event. So they would say, a vision. Well, what do you mean, objective or subjective? Because if it's objective, then Jesus is alive after death.
Mm-hmm.
If it's subjective, it's a hallucination. So they'll all say, well, yeah, it's subjective, of course. And then you point out about hallucinations. Well, there's been a lot of research been done on it over the last century, more than a century. And there are different ways to experience a hallucination. You can have a visual hallucination or an auditory hallucination, something where you smell something that's not really there, taste something that's not really there, have a sense of motion, like when you wake up in the morning because you had a sense of falling. That's called a kinesthetic hallucination.
Happens a lot.
Yeah. Or a tactile hallucination, when you thought your cell phone vibrated in your pocket because you got a text and you open it and it's like nothing.
Yeah, the other night I woke up going like this. I don't even know what I was dreaming about or whatever, but I just threw my arm up like that. Freaked me out.
So, only the group most likely to experience a hallucination are senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. But even at that, you only have an average of 7% who have a visual hallucination of that loved one. When we look at the reports, the earliest reports, like in 1 Corinthians 15, he appeared to the 12. He appeared to more than 500. He appeared to all the apostles. So at least you got the 12 and all the apostles. That would be 100%, not 7%.
Not 7%. And they weren't that elderly. Do you know what the statistics are for younger people that are bereaved?
That's a great question. They haven't done research on that.
Oh, okay.
And I've asked some folks that have, like Larry and Ailman, who co-authored the book Hallucinations, the Science of Idiosyncratic Perception, published by the American Psychological Association. I think it was 2007, something like that. And I asked one of the co-authors, and he told me that he was not aware of any studies that would show that there would be a difference. There might be.
Right.
But we just don't know.
Yeah, the only fear is that it would be higher, not that that would even necessarily change anything, but I would guess it. I don't know anything about this sort of stuff, but
it's certainly not going to be 100%.
Right. No.
Yeah. So that'd be one reason to reject it. Another thing would be group hallucinations. You've got at least 3 group appearances in that first report.
This really seems to be the defeater as far as I can tell, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just like no questions asked. That's why I've said I find it so easy to dismiss. That I was surprised that among scholars it's the most common because of what you're saying right now about group hallucinations. But sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
No, not at all. I'm glad. Feel free anytime. So, because hallucinations are like dreams insofar as there's no external reality to them, right? It's going on in your head. So I can't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and tell her about a dream that I'm having in Hawaii, that I'm there, and to go back to sleep, join me in my dream, and we can have a free vacation. You can't do that because it's going on in my head only. So you can't share a dream. You can't share a hallucination. And yet you've got 3 group appearances, at least 3 group appearances of Jesus to his disciples. Paul was not grieving Jesus' death. He was glad Jesus was dead. And so you wouldn't expect Paul to experience a hallucination of Jesus.
That's a good point, yeah.
If the tomb was empty, I think there's good evidence for the empty tomb, but if the tomb was empty, hallucinations don't explain how the tomb got empty. So there really is, and a hallucination really doesn't lead to the belief that the person's grave is empty, right?
Right.
Like my dad, when my mom died a couple months later, he experienced a visual hallucination of my mom in the middle of the night, but it didn't lead him to the belief that if he went to her grave, her body would be gone.
Right. It's one thing. Yeah. I mean, because that would be our first assumption. I just hallucinated. If you saw that, if that happened to me, my first thought would be, which actually is the first thought of the disciples, or their actual first thought is not resurrection in the Gospels. Their first thought is someone stole them. That's what I believe Mary says. What have you done with them? She thought that they stole the body. She didn't think she was hallucinating, so it's a bit of a stretch here. But I would assume that I was hallucinating, just like Mary assumed that the body was stolen, because that's what normally happens. That would be the usual way that would happen. So that's kind of a point to be made in for making this case, is that, well, they didn't even assume to start with, that it was a resurrection. It took further evidence to convince them.
That's correct. So, I mean, really, that only leaves one option now.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, you can
they
chase. Yeah.
they believed he rose from the dead because, you could say, well, another option is he didn't die and then he appeared.
Mm-hmm.
But then, really, if he'd been scourged and crucified, I mean, think of what he would look like, right?
Yeah. There's only one that it doesn't get left out. I have heard some people treat it, but it is a lot of times left out, and that is just that they were outright mistaken. That Jesus was crucified and put in the tomb, and then they saw somebody else, like, on the road to Emmaus or something like that, and they just thought that was Jesus. It wasn't really Jesus.
Yeah, except that wouldn't account for Paul, right?
No.
And
No, or the empty tomb.
Yeah, it wouldn't account for the empty tomb. It wouldn't account for why James, the skeptical brother of Jesus, converted and became a follower after his death, when he wasn't all the way up to the time of his death. And then he actually goes to his own death as a martyr because he won't deny that his brother's the Messiah, the risen Messiah and Lord. I mean, that's amazing, right? So, yeah, that just doesn't work.
No, yeah, for sure. I got some more questions for you real quick. I want to take a break and say thank you and give a shout out to our patron supporters. Thanks so much for your support, guys. I really appreciate it. I want to give a special thank you to Jonathan, our patron of the week. Jonathan, thanks so much for your support. If you are listening, I know what you've always dreamed of, what you've always wanted. You've always wanted to hear me give you a shout out on the show. Well, today's your lucky day. You can go become a patron supporter by following the link in the description and becoming a supporter of Help Me Believe, so we can continue to have discussions like we are today with Dr. Michael Licona, who is the co-author of The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And we've been discussing the resurrection, and we kind of just let this conversation flow. We've talked about positive points, and we've talked about objections that have been raised. I had this all out neat. Now here we are having a nice conversation all out of order. But this is really great. I'm really enjoying it, so let's continue the conversation. We talked about hallucination. You mentioned earlier, and so this is kind of go off topic of what we were just discussing, but you did mention earlier 1 Corinthians 15:3. I think that's the verse, the specific verse, or the beginning of the verses that I'm talking about here, where so in my dialogues with skeptics, whether online or whatever, in discussing the resurrection and trying to make the 5 minimal facts, or is that how? Yeah, and giving that argument for the resurrection. A lot of times they don't necessarily object with the objections that we've been kind of discussing here. Sometimes they just go straight for the dating of these things and say, no, the resurrection was actually perpetrated later on, and they'll hit me with questions that, as a non-technical historian or New Testament historian, it's like, well, when it comes to dates and stuff, I just kind of punt to these guys because I don't know why the dates are there. So how do we know that 1 Corinthians 15:3 and those verses really do trace back to just 3 to 5 years from the crucifixion or something like that?
Yeah, well, some would say 3 to 5 years. You've got, I think it's Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar, Gert Ludemann. I don't know where Funk was. He was pretty much a skeptic, though. And I know Ludemann is an atheist, New Testament scholar, and they both put it, I think, within 1 to 2 years of Jesus' crucifixion. And then you got James D.G. Dunn, who's kind of a moderate conservative scholar, and he says we can be entirely confident that it derived within 6 months. Now, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how they get to those dates. They don't provide any reasons. And as much as I like to say, hey, look, these are skeptics who are even saying this, it's always possible, but I don't think it's proven. So here's the approach I take, Haden.
Okay.
We know, most scholars will date 1 Corinthians written somewhere between the years 52 and 55, maybe 56, okay? And they seem to agree, and they do this based on the book of Acts, other of Paul's letters like Galatians, and they are able to establish a timeline of some sort. So they'll say 1 Corinthians was written somewhere between, let's say, 52 and 56. And Paul establishes the church in Corinth in the year 51. So he says, I delivered to you what I first received. So delivered to you of first importance what I received. So, and then he gives them that oral tradition. Christ died, was buried, was raised, he appeared, and then the different appearances. So he delivered it to them in 51, and of course he would have had to receive it before then, right?
Right.
So when did he receive it? And who gave it to him? Well, he doesn't tell us. But what he does tell us is that he had met with Peter 3 years after his conversion and spent 15 days with him. And the Greek word Paul uses there is historesi. We get the English word history from that. So Paul is visiting Peter, meeting with him to get kind of a history. Fill me in on Jesus. I know some what he's teaching because I used to think it was heresy. But tell me about your experience. Hey, did he really walk on water? Did you walk on water, Peter? What was that like?
Yeah.
And things like this. So he's learning all about these different stories. And then he says 14 years later, he goes back and he runs his gospel message past the Jerusalem apostles to make sure he's preaching what they're preaching. Okay. And in the meantime, he goes on a couple of missionary journeys. One of them is with Barnabas, another is with Silas. So it's like, okay, did he get it from Barnabas? Did he get it from Silas? Did he get it from Peter in his first visit? Did he get it from Peter, James, and John, the second visit to Jerusalem? Did he get it from Ananias immediately after his conversion? We don't know. He could have gotten it any time, the oral formula, that is. But of course, the content of it, what that oral formula proclaims, well, he would have gotten that, of course, from Peter, and probably even before then. He may have even known the content before then because he didn't believe what the gospel was that they were out there proclaiming. And we see what they were proclaiming in the sermon summaries in the book of Acts and in this kerygma in this oral tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. So, Paul knows that this is what the apostles are preaching. The format, the form of that he receives it in the creed, who knows when he received that?
Right.
But it was sometime before 51.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like the crux of the matter is, when was Corinthians written? Once you can establish that, then you can obviously say, well, he obviously, like you said, received this before them. And then, we can look to the book of Acts to see more of a timeline of when Paul was converted. And, like you said, there's multiple different options there that you could take. But I think the most important thing is just to say he received this very early and directly from the apostles. Obviously, it was even if he received it in 50, it would be like, well, that's still within the lifetime of the apostles, right?
Right.
So,
right. Still within their lifetime. And, of course, he would have still... It's not like he heard about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection when he received that formula, right? Yeah. He knew about it even before a Christian.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously. So, yeah, so I see how that works now. Let's move on to a specific person that I believe that you've debated before. You've debated Bart Ehrman before, probably multiple times.
6 times.
6 times, there you go. So I know I've watched at least 1 or 2 online, but his position on this has changed maybe multiple times. I don't know, over time on which objection or which critical theory that he agrees with or is in favor of. What is his current position on the resurrection? What is he in the camp with the other scholars who think this was a hallucination? Or
yeah, I would say the last time we actually debated on the resurrection would have been or that we had a discussion on it would have been 2011, I believe.
Yeah.
So that was 8 years ago. I don't know where he is on it now, but he seems like he's consistently, at least the time before then and up to then, has said that he thinks that they had visions of Jesus. And in our debate, when I said, clarify that, are you referring to a subjective or object? Do you think it was a hallucination? And I remember him saying, well, hallucination is kind of a pejorative term. And I said, well, no, not anymore. Not in that field, not in the field of the mental health. So he said, yeah, okay, well, hallucinations. So that's what he thinks it was. And he'll say, well, we know that some of them, how many of them had it, He doesn't. He says, I don't know. Were there any group experiences, group hallucinations? He says, I don't know. Did all of them see it or just some of them? He says, I don't know. But he admits that at least some of the apostles had them. Now, Gary Habermas, who is up on where scholars stand on this stuff more than anyone, he says the majority of scholars, even skeptics, will even agree that they had these experiences in group settings. But Ehrman's not willing to grant that.
Man, that's crazy how revealing or how much you have to seed in order to take that position. Or it seems like that to me. Like you just seeded so much, especially the ones who are granting group hallucinations. Is like,
Yeah.
we have zero evidence that group hallucinations are even possible. But this is the length to which you're willing to go to, deny a supernatural intervention here with an actual resurrection. That's quite telling, and it should be encouraging for anybody listening that the evidence for the resurrection is quite strong. But what is a strong point? I mean, obviously none are going to be that strong. Counterpoint, that you've heard from a skeptic, whether it be Bart Ehrman or maybe there's a scholar that's even a skeptical scholar that's even better than he is, or however you want to word that of that maybe the public doesn't, and some objections that they've made that what's a pretty good objection or the best objection you've heard, I guess, would be the best way to ask that
Honestly,
question.
I don't think that there are any good objections.
Right.
But if I had to say what's the best one, I'd go with the one by Geza Vermesh, the late New Testament scholar, Jewish New Testament scholar, who did not think Jesus rose from the dead. But he just said, well, there are no good explanations. We just have to throw our hands up and say, I don't know what happened. Something happened. I don't know what it was.
Mm-hmm. So, you either go with an agnostic position like that, or, man, I don't know about any good ones either, but some people just say, well, whatever happened, it certainly wasn't a resurrection. As we know, all 7 billion of us on this planet are going to die, and none of us are going to literally rise from the dead, which I don't know is true or not. I don't have that kind of knowledge, but that's more of a presupposition than anything. But
yeah, they would say something like David Hume would say, and he would say human testimony can be very reliable, but it's not always reliable. It's certainly not reliable 100% of the time. Far from it. And that's the evidence we have for the resurrection. So it could be good evidence, but it's not necessarily. And then he says the side against the resurrection, you've got things such as what we notice is that when people die, they dead, and we observe this with an exceptionless regularity, right? So, and we understand why people don't come back to life. So when you look at the evidence that's offered by human testimony, which is not perfect, there are plenty of exceptions to the reliability of human testimony. But then you look at the observation that when people die, they stay dead, they don't come back to life. And we observe that with an exceptionless regularity. Then you weigh these two and you say, well, okay, the side of people not coming back from the dead outweighs human testimony. But where Hume goes wrong on this is what science tells us. What we observe is that when people die, they stay dead. They don't come back to life by natural causes.
Right.
But that's not to say anything about if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus. So the example I'll give is, hey, what's the probability of someone walking on water? You can take everybody in the world and try to see if they can walk on water in a pool, a lake, a pond, the ocean, something like that. They're all going to sink. And if it came down to the last person who's a 3-year-old boy, and I said, here, give me your hands, and we're at a swimming pool, he gives him his hands, I hold him over the pool, I support his weight, and I walk along the pool as he walks on water. Well, 7 billion people unable to walk on water tells us nothing pertaining to whether this boy could walk on water. Mm-hmm. You say, Mike, wait a minute, you cheated because you were an external agent assisting him. That's exactly right.
That's what we're claiming.
And 7 billion people unable to walk on water unassisted tells us absolutely nothing about whether someone could walk on water assisted. Mm-hmm. And in the same way, 100 billion people dying and staying dead who don't come back from the dead unassisted, tell us absolutely nothing about whether someone could come back from the dead assisted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's really presupposing naturalism.
Exactly.
Well, I don't accept naturalism, so this isn't really, going to convince me. It'd be just like if I just said, how do you know God exists? Well, the Bible says so. Well, I don't,
Right.
The atheist doesn't believe that the Bible is God's word, which obviously would be circular reasoning, assuming that God exists. You get the point. Well, they assume naturalism on these kind of objections to the resurrection. Well, if you're still listening, thanks so much for joining us. I got one more question for Dr. Licona before we head into the bonus segment, so be sure to stick around for the bonus segment. You can follow the Patreon link in the description below to hear that or to watch that. Dr. Licona, perhaps there's somebody listening right now who is having doubts about, maybe they're a Christian who's having doubts about the resurrection. Maybe we just caused them to have some doubts about the resurrection. No, it's really not. But, maybe there's even some skeptics listening who are, obviously not believers. What in just, a few words, what would you say to these two parties before you go?
Well, I would say, when we're talking about historical evidence and making a historical case, we have to have reasonable expectations. There is no way to prove something beyond all doubt, not in history. You can't prove that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon beyond all doubt. You can't even prove that we all weren't all just created 5 minutes ago with food in our stomachs of meals we never ate and memories of events that never occurred. You can't prove beyond all doubt that we're not brains in vats somewhere just being stimulated by mad scientists to have the perceptions we're having. Mm-hmm. So we go with what seems to be the best explanation. And it's going to be no different with the resurrection of Jesus. We have to have reasonable expectation, and we look and, we can't get in a time machine, return to the past, and verify our conclusions. But we can look at the data. We can weigh the evidence and say, what's the best explanation? And when we do this, there really is only one explanation that can account adequately for all the data, and that's the resurrection hypothesis. So the best thing, if you're a skeptic, you can be honest and just say, well, I still just don't believe it. It's not enough for me. But, that's a better way than trying to just make up some kind of a lame excuse to account for it. But I'd say if you're really looking for truth, then look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, because if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true, period.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I really appreciate you coming on again and taking the time. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. One of my favorite authors, especially on the subject, but just in general. And so I appreciate you coming on and doing this.
Thanks, Haden. I appreciate it.